What was your
It's good to
reaction?
be back.
Decisive. It's a decisive decade for journalism. What was your reaction to that report?
Yeah. I mean, everybody who looks around right now, they can see, they can feel what's in the air. Everything is changing rapidly. We are seeing new powers being claimed. We're seeing new powers being abused. And we're seeing, of course, governments sort of tearing open new avenues into our private lives under the justification of emergency measures. They always say these are temporary, it's for this reason or that reason. But, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. And when I look at this, for as long as I have worked in technology, I've studied what's happening. I've looked at things. I've just tried to figure out what all of this means by looking at the world in terms of systems. And the more time passes, the more that method makes sense to me, because all of the processes that matter to us today, environmental, technological, social, political, they're all connected and they're all interdependent, parts of the same whole, parts of the same system. And that system is now failing. Our efforts to correct it are being stymied in large part because the first step to fixing a problem is understanding it. And humanity's traditional method for rapidly digesting and sharing information, journalism, is under attack. And I think that's an intentional strategy. I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's an unintentional overreach or an emergent reaction. And I hate to say that this is something that has been sadly true for as long as I can remember, as well documented by your work with Reporters Without Borders. But I regret to say that it seems the intensity of these attacks are increasing at the very moment when we're approaching what I consider the apex of crisis. In places where reliable information is most difficult to obtain, such as China, we witnessed new efforts to expel journalists and keep them out of the country and bar their work. We've seen pressure on their colleagues. We have seen influence campaigns against their outlets and institutions. And it's not just in China and places like it. In Brazil, federal prosecutors sought to imprison a journalist for exposing corruption in the justice ministry. In the UK, the whole of society is standing by as the most basic tenets of international law and human rights are being disregarded in order to extradite Julian Assange, the publisher of WikiLeaks, for 17 counts of espionage, which is, according to the charging documents, apparently how we've come to describe the act of publishing true and correct information for the public in the modern era. In Russia, we have seen major newspapers like Vedomosti have a change of ownership. Sort of oligarchs come in, shares get traded, and then suddenly you see chief editors being replaced, and the new guys in charge put their favored guy in, and suddenly he starts using his editorial authority to say, look, these stories are too political, changing this headline, saying you can't run this kind of reporting. And suddenly a newspaper that, at least by Russian standards, appears to be, more independent than some, suddenly looks a whole lot less independent. And it's not just one paper. We have seen this happening again and again and again, and this process is accelerating. In Russia, we see this dynamic happening at the same time the government, the state, is climbing up the ladder of sort of laws against so-called false information, the spreading of rumors. And again, we see this in many countries around the world, which tragically brings us to the United States, where no less than the president himself leads the same war in the same words from behind a podium that even his supporters admit is the origin of a great deal of the very fake news that he so often decries. And when we're talking about sources, just as we see the powers of our day, be they corporate or governmental, increasing their control over the means and conveyances of information under the justification that they're trying to stamp out false information, the sources of true information, the sources of journalism, are under the kind of threat that we have really never seen before. It has always been difficult to be a journalist's source, just as when you're breaking a truly impactful and meaningful story as a journalist, we know it has personal and professional risks, sometimes risks to life, unfortunately. But what we are seeing is what I think is a strategic transformation away from merely targeting journalists and journalist sources, who have always been the primary targets of persecution in this process, to now prioritizing and elevating secondary figures, secondary targets, as it were, in the news-making and public understanding processes. By this, I mean we are seeing for the first time retaliation being taken in a systemic way against oversight officials, against watchdogs, against inspectors general. And we see this happening in places like the United States. And these are just the smallest examples of a very long list of the threats that we see facing the work of a free press today. And yet a skeptical press is never more critical than in times of crisis. And it is in precisely these times of crisis that meaningful journalism has come to carry the greatest risk. So what does that mean? When we are making it more difficult to do journalism, when we are making it more difficult to gather, analyze, and disseminate, publish meaningful information that is critical to the public, and we are at a point of vulnerability where we need access to this information. What we are going to find very rapidly is we're not going to have access to information precisely at the moments when we need it the most. As a society and as the ultimate stewards of the system, the system of our world, we must be willing to protect those who do the work of warning and preparing us to weather this continuing series of shocks and at times assaults that are fundamentally the progress of history. We are always going to struggle. We are always going to face challenges. We are always going to have crises. Because building a society of the complexity and connection that is before us today, continuing that work, is difficult. There are people who will want to exploit that. There are people who will want to maximize their power. And there are institutions who will go against the current order of the day and try to upset it. And look, the work of journalism is imperfect, right? There are legitimate criticisms that can be made about this story, about this outlet, about this reporting. And yet, journalism is necessary. Corrections can be made. Improvements are a part of the process of journalism. Correcting the record is a thing. But if we cannot or do not protect journalism, the system of our world will fail, and the cost will be measured